The air in the courtroom was heavy that morning, as though the walls themselves were reluctant to witness another trial that promised to end like so many before. Swift judgments handed down, whispered rumors in the gallery, and the same tired faces of lawyers who measured justice by the hour. But this day carried something different, something unexpected, though no one could quite put a finger on it. Rows of benches were filled with restless townspeople who had drifted in not just out of curiosity but hunger, for gossip, for drama, for the chance to see someone else's life unraveled before their eyes. At the front, high above the polished oak floor, Judge Halvorsen adjusted his spectacles, his stern gaze sweeping across the room. His reputation was carved from decades of unyielding rulings and a voice that could silence even the boldest attorney. Yet even he seemed unsettled as his eyes rested on the woman seated near the defense table, her hands folded in her lap as if she were in church, her head slightly bowed, her presence quiet yet undeniably magnetic. Her name was Mara. To most who knew her, she was just another woman from the edge of town, the type who spent her mornings tending to a small garden and her evenings sewing by lantern light. She wasn't rich, nor was she schooled in law or politics. She was the kind of figure people passed on the street without giving a second glance, unless perhaps they noticed the calm steadiness of her eyes that never seemed hurried or afraid. That morning, however, those eyes were fixed on the floor, her silence growing heavier with each passing moment. She had been called to testify, not as a criminal, not exactly, but as a key witness to events that had already tangled so many lives into knots. Some whispered she didn't belong there at all, that she had nothing worth saying, while others insisted she was the one person who knew the truth everyone else wanted to bury. The lawyers argued back and forth, their words clashing like dull swords. The prosecution painted pictures of greed, betrayal, and broken contracts, weaving a story designed to condemn a man who sat rigid at the defense table, tall, weary, his knuckles white as he gripped the wood. His name was Elias, and though his shoulders carried the weight of accusation, his eyes kept sliding toward Mara, as if her silence alone might either save or destroy him. The defense attorney tried to cut through the noise, but his arguments lacked conviction. The crowd had already chosen sides, their murmurs buzzing like bees. And in the middle of it all, Mara remained silent. When the questioning turned to her, the entire room shifted. People leaned forward, the scrape of shoes against wood echoing as they strained to hear what she might say. But she didn't speak. Not yet. She sat there, her fingers tracing invisible patterns across the fabric of her plain dress, and when the prosecutor pressed her, when the defense begged her, she simply lowered her eyes. It was then Judge Halvorsen leaned forward, his voice breaking the standoff with a commanding authority that silenced every whisper in the chamber. "Mrs. Mara," he said, his words measured, each syllable carrying the weight of command, "this court demands your testimony. You have been silent long enough. The truth you hold is not yours to keep. It belongs to this court, to justice, and to every soul gathered here. Speak now." For a moment nothing stirred. The woman remained still, and an uneasy shiver swept through the benches. The judge's demand had left no room for defiance, yet Mara's lips did not part. She lifted her eyes slowly, and those who met her gaze felt something unexpected, as though she carried a depth of knowing too vast for her simple frame. Then finally she leaned closer to the microphone, and her voice, soft and almost fragile, broke the silence. "I will speak," she whispered. And though her words were no louder than a breath, the courtroom froze. Her voice was not the trembling tone of fear everyone expected, nor the harsh cry of accusation the lawyers craved. It was something else, calm, steady, but laced with a weight that seemed to still the very air. For reasons no one could explain, every man, woman, and child in that room leaned closer, hearts quickening, as though they knew that the world on the other side of her whisper would not be the same. The whisper hung in the air like smoke, thin but impossible to ignore, curling into every corner of the courtroom until even the creak of the ceiling fan seemed to fall silent. No one dared move. Mara's words had been soft, yet they carried with them a strange gravity, a pull that demanded patience, as though each person in that room instinctively knew more was coming and feared to miss a single syllable. The judge adjusted his spectacles again, his lips tightening, but he did not rush her. For all his authority, he too seemed caught in that spell, watching this simple woman as though the fate of the trial no longer rested in evidence or argument but in her voice alone. Mara breathed slowly, her eyes not on the lawyers or even on Judge Halvorsen, but on Elias, the man whose life now swayed between ruin and redemption. When she finally continued, her words were still no more than a whisper, yet every ear caught them as though the walls themselves carried her voice. "You think this is about contracts and money," she said, her tone steady, "but it is not. What happened was not written on paper. It was written in trust, in friendship, in promises made when no one was watching. You all ask who is guilty, but you do not see the truth. The prosecutor, a broad man with sharp eyes, shifted impatiently, his hand tapping against the table. Mrs. Mara, he said, his voice rising in the stillness, the court requires facts, not philosophy. Tell us plainly what you saw. His interruption broke the trance for a moment, a ripple of restlessness moving through the benches, but Mara did not look at him. Instead, she let the silence return before answering, and when she did, her whisper cut sharper than any shout. I saw betrayal, she murmured, and the gallery gasped as though the word itself carried fire. Elias flinched at her tone, his jaw tightening, his gaze dropping to the table before him. The defense attorney sprang up, stammering, trying to object, but the judge raised his hand. Let her continue, he ordered. His voice held no trace of irritation now, only curiosity, as though even he could not pull himself away from the story beginning to unfold. Mara closed her eyes for a moment, drawing breath, and when she opened them again they seemed brighter, more alive, as though she were looking not at the courtroom but at the memory itself. It was the night the contracts were signed, she said. I was there though I was not meant to be seen. Elias had invited his oldest friend, Samuel, into his home. There was wine on the table, laughter in their voices. They trusted one another as brothers do, or so I believed. I was in the corner, mending clothes for his children, quiet, unnoticed. But I saw everything. I heard Samuel speak of loyalty, of how their fortunes would rise together, how he would never turn against Elias. His words were honey, but his eyes. She paused, her whisper thinning into silence until the crowd leaned forward, waiting. His eyes were cold. They belonged to a man already counting what he would steal. A murmur rippled through the room, but it was quickly hushed. Mara's words, fragile as they were, carried more weight than the thick folders of documents the lawyers had argued over for days. The prosecutor tried to interrupt again, but Judge Halvorsen fixed him with a glare that silenced even his ambition. Go on, the judge said softly, and for the first time in years, his tone carried no command, only request. Mara's hands trembled slightly as she continued, though her voice never wavered. I saw Samuel place his hand on Elias's shoulder that night, swearing his loyalty. And yet, hours later, when Elias slept, I passed by the study and saw Samuel bent over the papers, changing the terms with his own hand. He thought no one saw him. He thought the ink would dry before morning, that no one would notice the trap he had laid. But I noticed. I saw the false signature, the numbers shifted, the promises twisted into chains. He left before dawn, smiling, and Elias believed in him still. Believed until the ruin began. Gasps echoed through the benches, and the defense attorney leaned forward, stunned, his own client staring at Mara as though seeing her for the first time. Elias's face was pale, his lips parted in disbelief. The prosecutor rose again, his voice sharp, trying to tear through the spell. You say you saw this, but where is the proof? Where are the papers? Where are the witnesses? Mara turned her eyes toward him, and though her whisper did not rise, it cut through his words like a blade. The proof is in what was lost, she said. The farms abandoned, the debts swallowed, the children who went hungry while Samuel grew rich. You want ink and paper? I give you hunger and tears. I give you the truth of what a man will do when his brother betrays him. The room went utterly silent. Even the prosecutor faltered, his next words dying on his lips. Judge Halvorsen leaned back, his fingers steepled, his gaze fixed on Mara with something close to awe. For all his years on the bench, for all the testimonies and lies he had heard, he had never seen a courtroom transformed by so little. A whisper, a memory, a truth too raw to be dressed in legal phrases. And still Mara was not finished. She lowered her gaze, her hands clasping tighter in her lap, and when she spoke again, her voice trembled just once. I am no lawyer, no scholar, she said, but I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. Samuel betrayed Elias, and the ruin you see now was planted that night. If this court cannot see that truth, then perhaps there is no justice left in this room. Her whisper fell into silence, and the silence itself seemed endless. The silence after Mara's last words was unlike any that had settled in that courtroom before. It was not the ordinary pause between testimonies, not the restless shifting of bodies waiting for the next argument. It was deeper, heavier, as though each person had been pressed into stillness by the weight of what had just been laid bare. Even the judge, who had presided over countless trials, sat without moving, his gavel resting untouched at his side. The faint ticking of the old clock on the back wall seemed louder than breath, each second stretching like a thread pulled too tight. For the first time since the trial began, Elias lifted his head fully, his eyes wet, his mouth opening to speak though no sound came. He looked at Mara not with anger or confusion but with something softer, something that broke through the hardness he had carried for weeks, gratitude and perhaps shame for relying on her silence until now. The prosecutor finally found his footing, his face flushed with the desperation of a man watching his carefully built case unravel in the hands of a woman no one expected to matter. He rose from his seat, his voice sharp. "Your Honor, we cannot allow this court to be swayed by sentimental stories and whispers of betrayal. The law requires evidence, not emotion. This woman speaks of things she claims to have seen, yet she brings no proof. Are we to discard the sanctity of law for the frailty of memory?" His words rang with practiced force, but the impact was dulled, as though the courtroom had already turned its ears away from him. The crowd murmured faintly, some nodding, others shaking their heads, but their attention slid back to Mara, waiting for what she might say next. Judge Halvorsen leaned forward, his hands pressed against the bench. His eyes, usually cold and sharp, now held something different, an ember of curiosity he had long forgotten. "Mrs. Mara," he said slowly, "the prosecutor challenges your testimony. He demands evidence. What say you to that?" His words carried no malice, no dismissal, only the measured tone of a man trying to balance the scales in a moment where balance seemed impossible. Mara lifted her head, her face pale but resolute. She did not flinch beneath the weight of the question. Instead, she whispered again, her voice carrying as if the room bent itself to hear her. "The evidence lives in more than paper," she said. "It lives in the people who suffered because of Samuel's betrayal. If this court will not hear my voice, then let it hear theirs. Call the farmers who lost their land. Call the mothers who wept when their children went hungry. Call the men who labored under promises that turned to dust. Do you think all of them imagined the ruin? Do you think hunger is an illusion or dead a dream? If you demand proof, you will find it written not on parchment but on the faces of the broken." Her words spread through the room like fire through dry grass, igniting murmurs, drawing tears to the eyes of those in the gallery who had indeed felt the sting of Samuel's rise. The prosecutor clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists, but his voice faltered when he tried to reply. Elias's attorney finally stood, his voice trembling not with fear but with the weight of something awakening inside him. "Your Honor," he said, bowing slightly, "the defense requests permission to call additional witnesses, those whose lives were directly scarred by Samuel's dealings. Let them speak, let the truth find its way into the light." For the first time in days, his voice carried conviction, as though Mara's whisper had not only breathed life into the case but into him as well. The judge nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on Mara before turning to the prosecutor. "You cannot silence her testimony, and you cannot silence theirs if they corroborate it. Do you object to hearing the voices of those who claim to have suffered?" The prosecutor hesitated. His career had been built on control, on weaving facts into nets from which defendants could not escape. Yet now he found himself cornered not by documents or contracts but by something far less tangible and far more dangerous, the raw weight of human suffering. To object would make him appear cold, blind to justice. To allow it risked unraveling everything. Sweat trickled down his temple as he forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. "If the court insists, let them speak," he muttered, though his tone betrayed the bitterness he tried to hide. The gavel struck lightly, and Judge Halvorsen made his decision. "This court will hear from those affected. Bring them forth. Let their voices be added to the record." A stir spread through the gallery, people whispering, exchanging glances, some already rising, eager to step forward. The air was alive with tension, with the sense that something extraordinary was unfolding. Mara lowered her gaze again, her hands clasped tightly, but a faint relief flickered across her face. She had broken the silence, she had planted the seed, and now others would water it with their truths. As order was restored, Elias leaned toward her, his voice breaking with quiet emotion, barely audible even to himself. "Why now, Mara?" he whispered. "Why speak when all was nearly lost?" She turned her eyes to him, calm and steady, and though her reply was soft, it carried the same weight as before. "Because silence would have been the greater betrayal. You needed truth, not pity. And the court needed to remember that justice is not measured in paper and ink." The judge, watching the exchange, felt something stir within him. He had long believed his role was to guard the boundaries of law, but in that moment he glimpsed something he had forgotten, that justice itself could not always be bound by contracts, that sometimes it lived in the whispers of those who had nothing but truth to give. The trial, once routine, had become something far greater. And though no verdict had yet been spoken, everyone present knew they had already been changed by a simple woman's whisper. The morning light shifted slowly across the courtroom windows, turning the dust in the air into golden threads, but no one noticed the passing of time. All eyes remained fixed on Mara, the woman who had turned the tide of a trial with nothing more than a whisper. Her words had opened a door, and now the space beyond it seemed endless, filled with truths waiting to be spoken. Judge Halvorsen cleared his throat, his voice deep but softened by something almost human, something that those who knew him well rarely heard. "Let the first witness step forward," he said, and his gavel struck once more, not to command silence but to invite voices into the space she had created. From the back of the room, an older man rose slowly, leaning heavily on a cane. His clothes were worn, his boots dusted with earth, but his eyes carried the fire of a man who had seen his livelihood stripped away. He introduced himself as Abram Keller, a farmer who had once worked land that had belonged to his family for 3 generations. His voice was hoarse but steady as he told the court how Samuel had promised loans, partnerships and shared profits, only to alter the agreements when no one was looking. "I signed my name with trust," Abram said, "but what I signed wasn't what I agreed. By the time I realized it, the farm was gone, my sons scattered to find work in other towns, and my wife buried without the home she loved." His words drew tears from the gallery, and the prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, his arguments wilting under the weight of grief laid bare. Next came a woman young, her face pale but her eyes sharp with quiet anger. She carried a child in her arms, no more than 2 years old, his small hand clutching at her dress. She spoke of her husband, who had taken work under Samuel's promises of fair wages, only to be left unpaid when debts piled up and contracts were twisted. "We ate bread crusts for weeks," she said, her voice trembling yet unbroken. "We begged for mercy and Samuel turned his face away. But his pockets grew fat while ours turned to rags." The child stirred restlessly against her shoulder, and the courtroom seemed to ache with the weight of her testimony. One by one, others stepped forward, laborers, clerks, widows, all telling variations of the same story. Promises made, promises broken, trust betrayed. The picture forming was no longer about one man's ruin but a pattern of destruction that spread like cracks through stone. The gallery murmured with anger now, not idle curiosity. These were not tales invented in shadows but scars etched on lives. And through it all, Mara sat silently, her eyes lowered, her hands still. She had unleashed their voices, and they poured into the room like a flood, unstoppable. The prosecutor attempted to stem the tide, rising again and again to object, to dismiss, to remind the court that none of these accounts were written into formal records. But each time he spoke, his words fell thinner, weaker, against the raw power of lived experience. Judge Halvorsen, who once might have cut such testimony short, allowed it to continue, his gaze steady, his jaw tight as though he too felt the scales tipping toward something greater than law as he had always known it. Elias sat frozen, his face a shifting canvas of shame, relief and sorrow. For weeks he had been painted as the villain, the reckless fool who had destroyed what others depended on. Yet now, as these voices rose around him, he was no longer alone. The truth that had seemed buried under layers of forged contracts and twisted deals was breaking the surface. And he knew, it was Mara who had struck the first crack. At last, when the judge raised his hand and silence returned, the room felt changed. It was heavier with sorrow but brighter with clarity, as though the lies that had cloaked Samuel's rise were finally stripped bare. Judge Halvorsen's voice, when he spoke, carried both gravity and weariness. "This court has heard testimonies beyond what it expected. The question remains whether these accounts, supported though they are by lived consequence, will stand against the written contracts that bind us to law. The prosecutor insists on proof, the defense insists on truth, and somewhere between them justice must be found." His words lingered and the crowd shifted uneasily. Mara lifted her head then, her whisper breaking the stillness once more. "The law should serve justice, not bury it," she said softly, yet her words carried through the room like a bell. "If you hold only to ink, you will protect the hands that twisted it. But if you listen to the voices of those who suffered, you will see the ink for what it is, a mask hiding betrayal." Her gaze was steady and even the judge, seated high above, felt the force of it. The prosecutor slammed his palm against the table, his voice sharp, desperate. "We cannot allow a courtroom to descend into emotion. If whispers and tears are enough to condemn, then every contract is meaningless, every law a plaything for stories." But his fury rang hollow, his eyes darting toward the gallery that no longer sided with him. The tide had turned, and though he fought against it, He was a man standing in a flood with nothing but bare hands. Judge Halvorsen said nothing at first, his mind churning. He had built his career on the bedrock of law, but here was a case where the letter of it clashed violently with its spirit. Mara's whisper, fragile as it was, echoed inside him, challenging the very foundations he had trusted. He rubbed his temples slowly, then looked down at her, at Elias, at the weary faces of the people who had spoken. In that silence, the entire room leaned on the edge of something vast, waiting to see whether the scales would tip toward paper or toward truth. And Mara, still seated quietly, folded her hands once more, her whisper already reshaping the destiny of everyone in that room. The weight inside the courtroom grew almost unbearable as the hours stretched, though no one dared leave. It was as if the walls themselves held their breath, waiting for the final truth to be laid bare. The gallery sat forward in their seats, faces tense, eyes locked on the front of the room where Judge Halvorsen leaned heavily over his bench, his hands clasped, his expression unreadable. The testimonies of the farmers, the widows, the workers still rang in the air, their pain etched into every corner of the chamber. Yet despite all that, one shadow remained absent: Samuel himself, the man at the center of it all. His presence loomed like a storm cloud, and though he had yet to speak, every person could feel his grip on the trial. Mara shifted slightly in her chair, her eyes steady, her hands folded in her lap as if she carried no fear of the storm to come. Elias sat beside her, his breath shallow, his body rigid, though his eyes softened every time they rested on her. He had lived weeks under accusation, shoulders bent under a burden he could not lift. But now, with her whisper breaking the silence and the voices of the betrayed rising behind it, he seemed for the first time to breathe again, even if the air was heavy with tension. At last the prosecutor rose, his face pale and tight with frustration. His voice carried more edge than authority now, brittle with the fear of losing a case he thought secure. "Your Honor," he said sharply, "we cannot allow this trial to be dictated by rumor and recollection. This is a court of law, not a marketplace for stories. The defendant may cloak himself in sympathy, but contracts are contracts. Written words, signed names, those are the foundation of justice. And this woman's whispers, however dramatic, cannot rewrite what is already sealed in ink." He paused, his gaze sweeping the gallery as if to draw strength from them, but their eyes no longer supported him. He swallowed and turned back to the bench. If we abandon the written truth for tears and shadows, then what separates justice from chaos? The words rang, but they fell flat, unanswered by the room. For though he spoke of law, the people had tasted something deeper, something older than parchment and signatures. Judge Halvorsen tapped his gavel once, not to silence but to steady himself, as though grounding his thoughts. Then his gaze shifted toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the chamber. "Bring Samuel forth," he commanded. "Let him answer these words with his own." The doors creaked open, and in stepped the man who had haunted every testimony. Samuel was tall, broad-shouldered, with a fine coat that shimmered faintly in the light, a symbol of his wealth. His hair was combed back neatly, his face composed, but his eyes betrayed the arrogance of a man too long accustomed to bending others to his will. He walked with deliberate slowness, his boots striking against the wooden floor, each step echoing in the hush. When he reached the stand, he glanced at Elias with a smile that did not reach his eyes, then turned his gaze toward Mara. For a brief second, something flickered there, recognition, perhaps even unease, but it vanished quickly, buried under the polished mask he wore. "Samuel," the judge said, his voice even but laced with weight, "you have been accused not only of altering contracts but of betraying trust, of building wealth on the ruin of others. You will answer these accusations before this court. Do you deny them?" Samuel's smile widened slightly, as though the question itself were beneath him. His voice, when he spoke, was smooth, calculated, the voice of a man who had practiced lies until they sounded like truth. "Your Honor, I deny them all. I have been nothing but fair in my dealings. If others mismanaged their affairs, if debts swallowed them, that is the cruel way of commerce. I did not betray Elias. I did not alter contracts. These are the inventions of a desperate man and a whispering woman who clings to shadows." His words slithered through the room, and for a moment, some shifted uneasily. He carried confidence like a weapon, and for years it had shielded him from consequence. But Mara's eyes never wavered. She looked at him with the same calm she had shown from the beginning, and when she spoke, her whisper sliced through his polished speech like glass through cloth. "I saw you," she said simply. "I saw your hand change the words. You cannot wash ink from truth." The gallery stirred, the murmurs rising again, but Samuel only laughed softly, shaking his head as though speaking to a child. You saw? A seamstress in the corner sewing shirts by candlelight? What value has your word against mine? Do you think the court will choose whispers over the solidity of contracts and coin? His arrogance filled the space, but behind it there was a flicker, a crack too small for most to see, but Mara saw it. She leaned forward slightly, her whisper carrying again, and this time it was not only a statement but a knife twisted gently into the heart of his composure. Do you remember the ink on your hand? She asked. The words struck like thunder in the silence. Samuel froze, his smile faltering just enough for the gallery to notice. The ink that smudged on your cuff, the sleeve you pulled down when you left? I saw it. You thought no one noticed, but I did. I remember because it stained the fabric I later washed. It would not come out. A gasp tore through the room. Elias's attorney shot to his feet, his eyes wide. The judge leaned forward, his expression sharp with sudden interest. Even the prosecutor's face drained of color as Samuel's mask slipped. His eyes darted for the briefest moment, searching for denial, for escape, but Mara's whisper had pinned him like an insect on glass. The crowd murmured louder now, their voices rising, not with uncertainty but with conviction. Samuel opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His silence, once a weapon, now betrayed him. Mara had spoken no louder than before, but her whisper had unveiled the flaw in his armor, a memory too precise, too vivid to dismiss. The judge's gavel struck once, and the echo rang like a bell of reckoning. In that moment, the tide had fully turned. The courtroom, once filled with murmurs of doubt, now swelled with a restless energy that could not be contained. Samuel stood at the witness stand, his polished mask fractured by Mara's quiet revelation. The smudge of ink on his cuff, an almost trivial detail, had landed like a hammer blow. It was not grand evidence, not a ledger or a contract, but something far more dangerous. It was memory, precise and undeniable, spoken by the one person he had never thought capable of seeing him clearly. For years, Samuel had built his empire on the belief that simple people did not matter, that their voices could be drowned beneath the weight of signatures and seals. Yet here he was, undone not by lawyers or officials, but by the whisper of a woman he once dismissed as invisible. The judge leaned forward, his sharp eyes fixed on Samuel. Answer her, he commanded, his voice low but iron. Do you deny that you altered those papers? Do you deny that the ink stained your own hand? The silence that followed was suffocating. Samuel's lips parted, but no words came. He looked at Mara, his gaze burning with both anger and something else, fear. He tried to steady himself, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow. Your Honor, this is madness. One woman claims she remembers a stain years old, and I am to be condemned? This is not justice. It is theater. But his tone wavered, and the gallery felt it. The people who had once listened to him with deference, now heard the cracks in his voice, saw the tremor in his hands. A farmer shouted from the benches, his voice rough with fury. Theater? You stole my land. Another voice followed. You left my children hungry. The room erupted, the cries of the broken rising like thunder, and for a moment, it seemed the court might break into chaos. The gavel struck hard, Judge Halvorson's voice booming, Order! There will be order in this courtroom. Slowly the noise subsided, but the fury remained, simmering in every face turned toward Samuel. Elias sat frozen beside Mara, his chest rising and falling with sharp breaths. For weeks he had felt crushed beneath the weight of accusation, but now, watching Samuel flounder under the pressure of truth, he felt a strange release. His eyes turned to Mara, who sat still as stone, her whisper still echoing in the air though her lips had closed. He realized then that she had not spoken for herself, not even for him alone. She had spoken for all of them, for every soul Samuel had trampled. The prosecutor, pale and sweating, rose once more, desperation clinging to him like a shroud. Your Honor, we cannot allow this trial to be decided by whispers and shouts. The law is not governed by memory. Contracts exist to preserve order, and if we discard them for tales, then we invite chaos into our courts. Are we to throw away centuries of practice because one woman claims she remembers an ink stain? His words, though loud, rang thin against the tide of sentiment pressing against him. Even he seemed to hear the hollowness of his plea. Judge Halvorson turned his gaze on Mara, then on the gallery and finally back to Samuel. His face was lined with the weight of years, and for the first time he allowed that weight to show. The law is written in ink, yes, he said, his voice slow, deliberate. But justice is written in the lives of those it touches. Contracts can be forged. Paper can be altered. But the suffering of these people is no illusion. The testimony of a simple woman, spoken in whispers, has revealed more truth than all your polished documents, Samuel. He paused, his gavel resting lightly against the bench. Do you truly believe this court blind enough to ignore it? Samuel's mask shattered then, his composure crumbling like old plaster. He slammed his fist against the wood, his voice breaking into rage. They are liars, all of them. Bitter, jealous peasants who could not manage what I gave them. And she, he pointed at Mara, his hand trembling, his face contorted with fury, she is nothing. A seamstress, a servant. How dare you take her word over mine? The words backfired instantly. Gasps and cries filled the gallery, and even the defense attorney stood taller, emboldened by Samuel's venom. Mara did not flinch at his accusation. She looked at him with the same calm, the same steady gaze and whispered, "Truth does not care what name I bear. You cannot silence it by calling me nothing." Her voice was so soft that those in the back strained to hear, yet it struck harder than Samuel's shouts. Elias placed a hand over his face, overcome by the collision of fury and revelation. The court, once balanced on the edge of doubt, now leaned unmistakably toward truth. The judge's gavel struck again, sharp as thunder. "Enough," he said, his voice heavy. "This court has heard more than enough. Samuel, your arrogance condemns you as surely as her testimony does. And Mara," his gaze softened if only slightly, "you have reminded this court what justice means when the letter of the law is twisted beyond recognition. You have done what none of us expected." The air seemed to shift then as though the building itself exhaled. The people in the gallery sat straighter, hope flickering in their tired eyes. Elias's hands trembled as he finally looked at Mara, whispering, "You saved me." But Mara shook her head gently, her eyes never leaving Samuel. "I did not save you. I only gave voice to what was already true. Justice saved you if it still has a place here." Samuel slumped against the stand, his arrogance leaking away until only fear remained. The trial was not over, the verdict not yet spoken, but everyone in the room knew the tide had shifted beyond his control. His empire, built on lies and contracts, was crumbling, and it had begun with nothing more than a whisper. And Mara, still seated in her plain dress with folded hands, waited quietly, as though she knew the court had only just begun to understand the power of truth set free. The morning after Mara's whisper had turned the courtroom on its head, the chamber was packed tighter than ever before. Farmers, merchants, widows, children pressed shoulder to shoulder, their breaths clouding the tall windows with anticipation. No one came merely to observe anymore, they came because they knew history was trembling on the edge of decision. The guards at the doors shifted uneasily under the weight of so many eyes, and even the lawyers who once held themselves with indifference, looked pale and brittle as dry parchment. At the center of it all, Samuel sat rigid, his hands clenching and unclenching in restless fury, his once polished aura of superiority cracked beyond repair. Elias sat a few benches behind, his chest tight as he waited for the words that would decide not just his fate, but the fate of everyone bound under Samuel's contracts. Mara, as always, sat quietly, her head bowed, her plain dress blending into the wooden benches, though to every soul in the room she now glowed brighter than any emblem of office. Judge Halvorsen entered, his robe sweeping the floor, his face carved with solemn lines that betrayed the gravity of what he was about to deliver. The gavel struck, and silence rolled across the room like a tide receding into deep waters. "This court has heard testimony," he began, his voice steady, resonant, "not only of papers and contracts, but of lives undone, lands stolen, and voices silenced. The accused, Samuel Herrick, stands not merely as a man but as the architect of a system that has bent law into a weapon against the very people it was meant to protect." His words cut through the silence, deliberate and sharp, and Samuel's jaw tightened as though each syllable struck him like a blow. The prosecutor rose as if to interject one last desperate defense, but Halvorsen silenced him with a raised hand. "We have heard enough rhetoric," the judge said coldly. "The law is not a stage for endless speeches. It is a mirror, and today we decide whether it reflects truth or deceit." The words hung heavy, and the gallery leaned forward, every breath sharp with suspense. Samuel, unable to bear the weight of silence, broke in with a snarl. "You would condemn me on the word of a seamstress? A woman of no title, no learning, no standing?" His voice cracked, desperation leaking into every syllable. "This court disgraces itself by even entertaining her whisper as evidence." His outburst sent ripples through the chamber, gasps rising from the crowd. But Judge Halvorsen did not flinch. He leaned forward, his dark eyes locked on Samuel. "Do you know what disgraces this court, Herrick? That a woman of no title shows greater courage and honor than a man who cloaks himself in wealth and law. You call her nothing, yet it was her word that revealed the rot beneath your ink. And if she is nothing, what does that make you who quails before her truth? A stunned silence followed, broken only by the sound of Samuel's labored breathing. Mara lifted her head then, her voice soft yet carrying through the hall. I am nothing as he says. But truth is not nothing. It is everything, and it belongs to all of us, whether we wear robes or rags. The simple words rippled through the gallery like fire catching dry grass. People murmured, some nodding, some whispering prayers, and even Elias felt his chest swell as if a chain had fallen from it. The judge raised the gavel once more. This court recognizes the courage of Mara Valen's testimony. It recognizes the suffering of those who came forward. And it recognizes that Samuel Herrick has exploited the law for his own gain, twisting contracts into shackles. This court finds him guilty. The gavel struck like thunder, final and absolute. The gallery erupted, not in chaos but in a roar of release. Cheers, sobs, cries of vindication filling every corner of the chamber. Elias buried his face in his hands, tears breaking free, while the farmer who had shouted days earlier embraced the widow beside him, both trembling with relief. Samuel leapt to his feet, his face contorted with rage. You fools, he bellowed over the noise. You think this is justice? You think a word whispered in the dark outweighs power and gold? You will regret this day. Guards moved swiftly, gripping his arms, but his voice carried one last bitter echo. The law was mine to command, and you have torn it apart with sentiment. You have doomed yourselves. They dragged him away, his shouts dwindling into the corridor beyond, leaving the chamber lighter in his absence, as though a storm cloud had finally lifted. In the stillness that followed, Judge Halvorson spoke again, though his voice was softer now. Let it be remembered that justice is not found only in ink and seals. Sometimes it is found in the courage of those who have no power but truth. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell for the last time, and the people surged to their feet, their voices rising in gratitude, in triumph, in disbelief that the mighty had truly fallen. Mara sat quietly amid the noise, her hands folded in her lap. People turned to her, some reaching to touch her hand, others whispering her name as though it were a blessing. But she did not bask in their praise. She simply lowered her gaze, whispering to herself, "It was never my word. It was truth itself." Elias knelt before her, tears streaking his face, and grasped her hand. "You saved not just me, Mara. You saved all of us." She looked at him, her eyes calm and clear, and said only, "Then guard it well. Truth is a fragile thing if left in silence." The people cheered, the judge departed, and Samuel's empire crumbled, but Mara remained as she always had, quiet, unadorned, her strength found not in titles or power, but in the whisper that had reshaped the world that in the days following the verdict, the town transformed in ways no one could have predicted. What had once been a place weighed down by fear and silence now thrummed with a new kind of energy, as though the very air had been cleansed. Neighbors who had walked with eyes cast downward began to greet each other openly in the streets, their voices carrying a pride that had long been buried. Farmers returned to their fields with a sense of ownership restored, no longer dreading the arrival of men with papers demanding payment. The market, which had grown thin and dreary under Samuel's grip, now burst with color and sound as merchants laid out their goods with laughter and unguarded conversation. It was as if the town had been asleep for years and Mara's whisper had been the spark that woke it. Yet amid the bustle and renewal, Mara remained the same. She did not step onto platforms to deliver speeches, nor did she allow herself to be crowned with the titles others wanted to give her. She returned to her small cottage, to her work with needle and thread, as though the storm she had unleashed was no more than a breeze passing through. Still, her name traveled far beyond the courtroom walls. Letters came from neighboring towns, from villages that had suffered under men like Samuel, asking her to speak, to guide, to lend them the strength she had shown. She turned them away with kindness, insisting that it was never her voice that mattered, only the truth itself, and that truth belonged to everyone. Elias visited often, unable to shake the debt he felt toward her. Though his land was restored, though his family once again had a place to call their own, he confessed to her one evening that he felt unworthy of the life he now held. She looked at him steadily, her hands folded in her lap, and told him, "Do not waste freedom by doubting it. Live it. That will be repayment enough." Those words struck him more deeply than any victory could, and from that day forward, Elias became a protector not only of his family's land but of the spirit that had returned to the town. He spoke often of Mara's courage, though she always corrected him gently, reminding him that courage was nothing more than truth spoken aloud. Samuel's downfall rippled beyond the town as well. The court stripped him of wealth and standing, and though he cursed his accusers to the end, his name became a warning rather than a badge of power. Where once he had been seen as untouchable, a man who could bend law like iron in his grip, now he was remembered as the man brought low by the whisper of a seamstress. For many, that was the greatest justice of all, that the mighty could be humbled not by armies or riches, but by a single quiet voice. Judge Halvorson too changed in those days. Though his ruling had been firm, even he admitted that he had not expected the trial to reshape the town so completely. He often told others that justice had not been delivered by his gavel but by Mara's courage, and he carried her words with him into every case that followed. In time, his reputation spread as a judge who valued not the weight of wealth or influence but the strength of truth itself. Many said his transformation was proof that even those who held power could learn humility, given the right reminder. The town marked the anniversary of the verdict a year later, not with pomp or speeches but with a gathering in the square. People brought bread, fruit, and music, sharing freely without fear of taxes or contracts looming over them. Children played without caution, their laughter ringing in the air, while elders sat together, remembering how close they had come to losing everything. When Mara appeared at the edge of the square, people rose to greet her, pressing her hands, thanking her again and again. She smiled faintly, nodded, and reminded them, "Do not thank me. Thank yourselves for listening." Her humility became legend as much as her whisper, and though she never sought to be a symbol, the people made her one all the same. Years passed, and her story carried beyond the boundaries of the town. Travelers told it by firelight on distant roads, mothers whispered it to their children at night, and those oppressed by other men like Samuel found strength in the reminder that even the quietest among them could bring change. The tale shifted in form as all legends do. Some said she shouted, others that she sang, but at its core the truth remained. A seamstress with no weapon but her voice had toppled a tyrant. As for Mara, she lived out her days in the same modest way she always had. She tended her garden, mended garments, offered a kind word when asked, and never once claimed the power others tried to place upon her. In her final years, when asked what she thought of the legacy she had left, she answered simply, "If my whisper became a voice for many, then it was not mine anymore. It was theirs and it always will be." When she passed quietly in her sleep, the town mourned not with despair but with reverence, knowing that her spirit was woven into the very fabric of their lives.